Greetings, fellow humanoids, and welcome back to the Versal Plane, home to all manner of magical mayhem. This evening's eclectic collection of characters includes me, the one and only once and future Cap without a country, on my own and by myself, as I wander the wondrous world of solo RPG in this inaugural installment of Table for One. Tonight, I begin with the first session of Max Moon's 12 Years, in which I will take on the role of a group of adventurers who have learned that the Lich King lurks in the Sunken Castle of the South, waiting for the completion of the coronation ritual that will extend his slumber. If that ritual is not completed in time, then he will lay waste upon the known world. I must assemble a party willing to risk their lives for the good of all, or at least for some treasure and glory, in an adventure that I will be calling Prophecies and Dreams, because I am a fan of obscure Shakespearean references. My party must journey into the wilderness on a search for a crown to appease the Lich King. Only once he's crowned will he rest for another 12 years. I will alternate between two modes of play as the game progresses, hexploring and delving. Venturing through the wilderness, or hexploring, I'll roll on various tables to generate encounters and terrain each time my party moves into a new region, potentially revealing mysterious labyrinthine locations for further exploration. The greatest treasures will lie hidden within dungeons, because delving is both more treacherous and more rewarding, and upon entering a dungeon, I will roll to generate its loot and encounters as well. Whether hexploring or delving, my party will face dangerous interactions, and they must assess the situation and choose whether to fight or flee. Both choices will contain risk and reward, and there is no shame in avoiding an unnecessary confrontation when I'm on a quest to save the world. There are no turns in 12 Years. Play is considered parallel. Parties and enemies act simultaneously, and combat is resolved through a minimal mechanic that uses a single roll for my party's attack and defense, and the enemy's attack and defense. A fight is a flurry of chaotic blows. It is rapid, and often after the blood and dust clears, no one quite knows what occurred. My party will fight together as one group, but they will take damage individually and mostly at random. Death undoubtedly lies ahead for any given party member. It is unlikely that my first party will succeed. I may go through many teams before finding a crown and sieging the Sunken Castle of the South. In their adventures, my party will gain experiences never imagined. Opportunities will arise to level my party, always as a group rather than individuals. Gold and loot are the concrete representation of experience, and my party will meet those who will offer level advancement in exchange for gold. I may meet and recruit new friends on my explorations, but I must be wary of the Fae and their lore. Many have entered the Fae in the morning and come home later that day to find their children grown and their spouses remarried. They have often found that what seemed like mere minutes had turned out to be 12 years. Having accepted this quest, I am tasked with finding a crown, sieging the Sunken Castle of the South, and placing the crown upon the brow of the Lich King. If accomplished before 12 years have passed, then I will have saved the known world. If 12 years pass, then the destruction of the living world will begin, and all will surely be lost. It is unlikely that I'm going to prevail, but I will certainly give it a try, and I will do my very best not to blame Max Moon when the many members of my parties die miserably. To begin assembling my party, I'm going to roll a d4 4 times to determine the archetypes of the members of my team. And I have been sitting here holding those d4 because they are notoriously difficult to pick up off of flat surfaces. So, that's a 2, a 1, a 2, and a 3. So my party includes a rogue who can automatically disable any traps the party encounters, but who avoids combat and lets others take a hit. If an attack targets the rogue, I re-roll the target, and if the attack targets the rogue a second time, then they take the damage. This character has 12 hit points and shall be named Horace. My second party member is a Hermit, who can fully heal the party instead of the party doing any damage to an enemy if the party rolls a successful hit, in part because they're also a pacifist, being untrained in combat and unable to use any armor, shields, or weapons other than a quarterstaff. This character has 8 hit points and shall be named Erenor. My third party member is another rogue, so that's 2 adventurers disabling traps and avoiding combat. This character also has 12 hit points and shall be named Phineas. And my fourth party member is a Faefolk who can help them avoid any lost in the Fey rolls and circumstances, but who is averse to iron and unable to use metal armor or any weapon other than a sling, a staff, or a bow. This character has 10 hit points and shall be named Tamerind, which I believe is an Indian and Filipino spice. I'm then going to roll the d4 4 times to determine the party's starting gold, which doesn't need to be recorded individually because the party shares gold freely. For this group, that is a 2 for 5 gold, 1 for 1 gold, 4 for 20 gold, and 3 for 10 gold, for a total of 36 gold. I'm then going to roll a d6 4 times to determine each adventurer's starting weapon. That is a 5 for Horace the Rogue, who gets a quarterstaff that inflicts 1d6 of damage. I don't have to roll for Erenor the Hermit because he can only wield a mundane quarterstaff. That is a 1 for Phineas the Rogue, who apparently gets a battle axe that inflicts 1d12 of damage, and a 2 for Tamerind the Fey, who would get a spiked flail if he didn't have the iron-averse weakness, so he also gets a quarterstaff instead. I'm then going to roll a d12 and a d6 4 times each to determine the type and quality of each adventurer's starting loot. So that is a 5 and a 2 for Horace the Rogue, who gets a shield that is mundane, giving him 1 extra hit point. That's another 5 for Erenor the Hermit, who doesn't get a shield because he's unable to use shield. That is 7 and a 5 for Phineas the Rogue, who gets armor that's magical, giving him 4 extra hit points, and meaning that I also have to roll an additional d8 to determine the magical properties of his loot. So that is 6, meaning that this is thorning armor, which is covered in magical thorns and either adds 1 additional point of damage to every successful attack, or can be used 1 time to add 1 to a single attack roll. He is going to take the +1 to the damage rolls because he seems like the kind of adventurer who wants to maximize his damage. And finally, that is another 7 and a 1 for Tamerind, who would get armor if he didn't have the iron-averse weakness. But it also wouldn't matter because the armor would be broken. So that is 2 shields and 2 suits of armor for a team on which 2 of the adventurers can't use 2 of those items. I'm going to keep my dices down here so that I'm ready to roll them when the time comes, and these d4s are going to stay in my hand. Alright, so I've got my party in a town with no name, in a country with no name, on a continent with no name, in a world with no name. And so we are, as far as I can tell, going to make it all up as we go. On the night leading into the morning that this particular adventure commences, Phineas dreams of an infinite battlefield beneath a scarred and scarlet sky, the warriors of light and life being mercilessly slaughtered by the infernal blades of an undead force on fearsome steed. The shadow of an emaciated figure looms along the skyline, and Phineas feels himself paralyzed within his own mind, unable to move as the figure seems to look into him across uncountable miles and years, with a pair of tiger-eye gems that swirl with a faint, horrifically familiar mist. And a rumbling laugh rolls across the ghostly, ghastly landscape. And then he wakes, shortly after midnight, to the soft sounds of the night winds drifting across the field of pampas grass, entirely unaware that somewhere else in this town with no name, Tamerind, who I imagine to be a sort of flightless sprite, allows himself the rare indulgence of dreaming, and finds himself lying on a stone altar at the center of a small grove, dressed in moonlight and stardust, as he has occasionally since leaving the mists of Elfine, and a dozen creatures gather around, wailing and howling into the skies in anguish, each of them with the head of a jackal, and the wings of a jackdaw, and the hind legs of a jackrabbit. And then he wakes, in the early darkness of the witching hour, entirely unaware that somewhere else in this town, with no name, Horace is also dreaming, though as a mundane human, he has no control over when that does or does not happen. And Horace finds himself on a wooded hillside among the firs and pines and evergreens, listening to the sound of a few wolves calling out to each other in the distance. He watches the umber sun plunge behind the western horizon before heading up a faint trail that leads to the front porch of a decrepit-looking cabin where he spots a woman. And I just dropped my D4. Mark it. That's the first time. Ah, there it is. One down. He spots a woman wearing a surprisingly ornate cloak as she sits in a rocking chair. He approaches without speaking, and she tells him that he's been gone for a very long time. And she laughs gently when he asks who she is, tilting her head and telling him only, "The great adversary seeks the soul of the first, the breath of the second, and the blood of the third." And then he wakes in a bed that isn't his, in the company of a woman wearing a shirt that is his, entirely unaware that somewhere else in this town with no name, Erenor has been awake for nearly an hour, at a tavern called the Cautionary sitting by himself at a corner table and listening to the overlapping currents of half a dozen conversations at once. He eats breakfast as he jots notes into a tattered journal, recording bits and pieces of whatever he happens to overhear, but his attention is immediately captured when the front door bursts open and an ancient elven man stumbles into the room, his chromium eyes wild and unseeing. He speaks to no one in an unfamiliar language that Erenor somehow understands, the wispy mists of Elfine clinging to his ravaged robes and fairish bristlethorns tangled in his hair and beard, and Erenor watches with horrified fascination as he scribbles frantically into the pages of his notebook. This morning after break of day, a wild prophet returned from Fae. Madness plagued his addled mind as threads of sanity unwind. Smile shone of secrets learned and visions of the known world burned. The prophets ranting hardly heard, yet I alone did heed their word. The king of old and risen bone rots with hatred on his throne. Bear the skull that bore a crown. A coronation shall lay him down. 12 years from now, if none succeed, an undead force on fearsome steed will burn the living world so swift that death becomes a welcome gift. The dining room goes briefly silent, and as Erenor scratches out the final word into his notebook, the man draws a raspy gasp and begins giggling uncontrollably. And then, like the legend of Phidippides, who is said to have run 25 miles to the city of Athens to announce the victory at the Battle of Marathon, this wild prophet delivers his apocalyptic proclamation and then promptly collapses and dies in the middle of the tavern in this town with no name. And as the initial commotion of this incident settles and the rumors of it spread, the people of this town realize that no one knows the name of this wandering prognosticator. In the days that follow the death of the wild prophet, Erenor finds himself haunted by the stark and sparkling darkness he saw in the stranger's turbulent eyes, and he spends the next few days searching for any information he can uncover regarding this nameless drifter, discovering that the only person who remembers seeing the wild prophet before he set foot inside the tavern was a 9-year-old urchin with a reputation around town as a bit of a pickpocket who witnessed the wanderer arriving from the southeast. So Erenor Mythrael returns to the cautionary tale the next morning and recruits a team from amongst the patrons. The twin brothers, Horace and Phineas Manning, accept the job to escape the monotony of working at their family apothecary, and the flightless sprite calling himself Tamerind Birch accepts the job because his curiosity has been piqued when he recognized the fairish bristlethorns tangled in the wild prophet's hair and beard. Erenor visits his old mentor, a Corvidian healer known only as Ray, leaving his journal and some of his personal belongings for safekeeping. And the party spends the day preparing for their journey into unknown territory before spending the night drinking until they all pass out. And so, the next morning, 7 days after a nameless stranger prophesied the rise of an undead king before shuffling off this mortal coil, and with 4,377 days until the destruction of the living world, our party ventures forth leaving the relative safety of the town of Zurgontal and heading southeastward into the heretofore uncharted regions of the Daksinatha Peninsula. We now enter the exploration phase of the game, which entails the party's overland travel and may in some cases be quite direct as they make haste toward a clear objective. Other times they might meander, searching for signs of a dungeon entrance. They'll meet all sorts of creatures and travelers, while the Fae will find themselves most useful here, as their ancient lore will serve as a warning against becoming lost and entranced. Now, the rulebook doesn't indicate exactly how large a hex is meant to be, so I'm going to treat these regions as being 12 miles to a side, specifically because that means that the distance from one side of a hex to the other is 20 and 3/4 miles, and the distance of the long diagonal is an even 24 miles, which is the distance that an adventuring party can cover in one day at 3 miles per hour. This also makes each hex about 374 square miles, or just smaller than Transylvania County, North Carolina, and means that the entire map covers about 22,440 square miles, or a little larger than the Republic of Croatia. As our party progresses southeastward to retrace the last known steps of this wandering prognosticator, I'm going to roll a d6 to determine what sort of terrain they encounter here. And that's a 5. So as they push out beyond the edges of the settled region they're comfortable with, they begin to ascend into the heights of the Spiresian Hills that are undoubtedly visible from their hometown just 14 miles away. Because this is their first time entering an area dominated by hills, I'm also going to roll a d12 to determine what sort of encounter they have here. And that's a 9, which is interesting. Okay, so the party travels through the morning until they arrive at a wide stream rolling down out of the hills, and they stop there for lunch, and then they decide to follow the riverbank upstream for a few more hours. By late afternoon, they reach the base of a 30-foot cliff where the stream is fed by a waterfall, and set back amongst the trees, they discover what Tamerind immediately recognizes as a fairy circle, a fixture designed to fully heal anyone who rests within this area. He also discovers that this particular circle was grown from a ring of bristlethorn bushes, the leaves of which feel like sandpaper, the flowers of which can induce vivid dreams, and the thorns of which look like jagged chips of metal that match exactly the bits that were found tangled in the hair and the beard of the wild prophet that died in the Cautionary tale. So the party makes camp for the evening in a sheltered alcove at the base of the cliff, and they trade stories about their families. Phineas talks about how smart their sister is, and Horace talks about how annoying it is that she tries to follow them around all the time, but mostly because he doesn't want her to get caught up in all the trouble they get up to. Tamerind talks about his distant cousin, a satyr who enjoys tricking Mythraelians into eating fairish berries that make them forget themselves and then luring them across the mists of Elfine, where the rest of his family lives. And Erenor talks about how his mother died 6 years ago, trying to kill a cyclops that had killed her brother 2 years before that, and how his father barely killed that cyclops, but then died a year later because of the cycloptical curse. Night passes, and the group wakes on the morning of the 8th day, feeling more refreshed than they have in months, and they set out westward in search of this alleged crown that Erenor had told them could somehow appease the Lich King, who would supposedly be returning in 12 years to apparently lead the destruction of the living world. As they enter a new hex around midday, they find themselves descending the Spiresian Hills and making their way into the Xantre forest that actually grows all the way up to the southwestern border of the town of Zurgontal. Because this is their first time entering this area, I'm going to roll another d12 to determine what they encounter here. That's a 4, which is a poisonous toad, which means technically that it excretes a toxin that can be inhaled, ingested, or absorbed through the skin, rather than delivering a toxin through a bite or a sting, which would make it venomous. So, now there are two options. The party can either attempt to evade the situation, or they can engage in combat with a toad. And because I'm more interested to see how these particular mechanics play out, the party is in fact going to engage in combat with a toad. This part of the game occurs in a sort of frenetic frenzy rather than a tactical turn-by-turn sequence, and attack rolls represent all of the strikes and parries by everyone in the area simultaneously. A round of combat entails a single d6 roll that applies to the entire party and all of the enemies in the encounter and represents the net outcome of what would be a full round in Dungeons & Dragons. Damage is dealt by the whole party or by all enemies rather than as individual characters, and every attack roll hits. The result simply determines who does damage to who and how much they do. Either the party hits the enemy weakly, normally, or palpably, or the enemies hit the party weakly, normally, or palpably. If the party hits the enemy, all damage dice for all adventurers are rolled together and any bonuses are added. So for this party, that includes a d6 for Horace's quarterstaff, plus a d6 for Erenor's quarterstaff, plus a d6 for Tamerind's quarterstaff, plus a d12 for Phineas's battle axe, plus another point for Phineas's thorned armor. In another party, this would also include another point per adventurer per level, as well as another point for each giant because of their brute force trait. That total is then halved on a weak hit or doubled on a palpable hit, and the damage is applied to a single enemy of the player's choice. If that enemy dies, any excess damage carries over to the next monster. If the enemies hit the party, all damage dice for all enemies are similarly rolled together. In this case, a single d12 for a solitary toad, and all of the damage is sustained by a single adventurer, determined by assigning a number to each member of the party and then rolling a d4. An adventurer dies when they're reduced to 0 hit points. No death saving throws. In which case, any remaining damage is sustained by another member of the party, determined by rolling again. If the next target is a rogue, their self-preservation attribute triggers another roll, and if that rogue is targeted a second time, then they sustain the damage. And so, as my party encounters this poisonous toad in the midst of the Xantray forest, Tamerind notices the bright fuchsia swirls on its back and realizes that the substance produced by this particular creature can be used to make a powerful antitoxin. So he approaches it slowly, trying not to startle it, and that is a 2. The enemy deals normal damage to the party. As Tamerind creeps closer, the toad just watches him until he's a few feet away, and then it expands for a second before it expels a burst of bright fuchsia dust right into Tamerind's face, causing 6 points of damage, leaving Tamerind with just 4 hit points. Having played a stupid game and won a stupid prize, the party is going to attempt to evade any further interaction. And they're going to fail, because that is a 1, which means that not only do they not escape the situation, but the enemy hits again. And on another 2, the enemy deals normal damage again, expelling another burst of that bright fuchsia dust into Tamerind's face. So he's coughing violently, and his face is swelling up, and his eyes are watering, and then he suffers another, oh wow, that would be 5 points of damage, but Tamerind's only got 4 hit points left, so he just collapses there on the forest floor, and Erenor takes the other point of damage as he rushes forward, trying to cover his nose and mouth as he drops to his knees next to Tamerind and starts scrambling to try to heal him. Unwilling to abandon Tamerind, the remainder of the party realize that they have to finish this fight. And on another 2, the enemy deals normal damage again. As Phineas takes a swipe with his battle axe, but his self-preservation triggers a reroll that still ends up targeting him. So as Erenor struggles to heal Tamerind, while trying to cover his own face, the toad expands and expels another burst of bright fuchsia dust right into Phineas's face, causing 8 points of damage, leaving Phineas with 8 hit points. Now he's coughing, and his face is swelling. And what in the entire world? This party can't catch a break. That's a 1, which means that the enemy deals severe damage to the party with a palpable hit. So this toad, having already successfully incapacitated one fully grown young adult humanoid, hops up onto Tamerind's chest, about a foot from Erenor's half-covered face, and expels another burst of bright fuchsia dust, causing 5 So that's doubled to 10 points of damage. Except that Erenor's only got 8 hit points left. So as he tries to help Tamerind, his hand drops away from his nose and mouth, and he accidentally just breathes the dust in. And he doesn't even start coughing. He just stops breathing and collapses as well. At which point, hey, there it is. The first hit by what remains of this team. On a 4, the party deals weak damage to the enemy, which is going to be a 9 and a 4, plus 1 for 14 points of damage, halved to 7, which is more than sufficient to kill this toad with all 4 of its hit points. But now, given the arrangement of this situation, I actually think that Erenor collapses forward across Tamerind's chest, crushing the toad between them for what amounts to 7 points of body weight damage. And so, about 30 seconds after it began, this ill-fated altercation comes to a close as a light breeze rustles through the trees and carries away the last of that bright fuchsia dust, and Horace cautiously confirms that Erenor and Tamerind have in fact both shuffled off this mortal coil. Phineas just sort of backs away from the bodies and sits on a fallen tree, his eyes still watering and his face itching. And then Horace joins him, and the two of them realize that they're not going to be able to carry 2 bodies almost 25 miles back to town. They also realize that there's no one there to bring either of them back to. And after another hour of deliberation, they finally decide that the best they can do is arrange the bodies as respectfully as possible in a slightly more secluded thicket of trees, place gold coins over each of their eyes to pay for their passage to Hymenas, and set memorial stones above their heads so that their final resting places will still remain marked long after nature does what nature inevitably does. Phineas also collects the carcass of the dead toad, hoping that if he delivers it to his parents, they'll at least be able to make something from it, and these two won't have died for absolutely nothing. He wraps it up in a handful of leaves, being careful not to touch it, and then he and Horace hike a mile southwest before making camp for the evening. Darkness falls, and they eat without conversation, the silence broken only by the snapping of the fire and the occasional sound of Phineas coughing and clearing his throat. Night passes, and Phineas sleeps fitfully, experiencing an erratic succession of disjointed fever dreams from a toxin still drifting through his system. He doesn't remember anything more than a few scattered images from them, except for one, a fiendish, disfigured face with a pair of serrated horns curving up and back from its forehead, grinning out of the swirling shadows as it rumbles. Join me in the southern darkness. He wakes on the morning of the 9th day, feeling sore and disoriented and absolutely convinced that they have to travel further south to confront the creature from his dreams. And he spends most of the morning convincing Horace to accompany him before the pair finally sets out southeastward. As they enter a new hex around midday, they find themselves entering a low-lying wetland, and Phineas suffers another point of damage from the lingering effects of the toad's poison, leaving him with 7 hit points. Because this is their first time entering this area, I'm going to roll another d12 to determine what they encounter here, and that's a 5, which is a friend. So now I get to roll a d10 to determine the nature of this friendly encounter, and that's another 5. So as this pair of twin brothers make their way across the marshlands, one of them currently straining to clear his throat because of a toad that killed his party's healer and Fey guide, they hear a splashing approaching them and see a half-crazed halfling, which I think mathematically makes him a quarter-crazed, emerge from a stretch of tall switchgrass to the southwest and skid to a stop about 10 feet away. He's got small white flowers in umbrella-shaped clusters clinging to his tattered clothes and a stark and sparkling darkness in his turbulent eyes. And Horace can immediately smell the distinctive scent of mouse piss emanating from this stranger. After a long moment, he starts making his way around the twins, pointing away toward the east and encouraging them to head that way, explaining that he'd come from that direction, which is safe as far as he's aware. When asked his name, he calls himself Thaddeus Bradford, and as Phineas starts coughing again, the halfling hurries in the directions that the twins had just come, yelling back at them not to wander into the tall switchgrass. They listen to the splashing footsteps recede toward the northwest for a bit, and then briefly consider wandering into the tall switchgrass, specifically because the halfling told them not to. After which they do instead decide to head in the direction that Thaddeus had pointed. So the twins cross the marshlands through the rest of that day until they find a little bit of a mesa rising about 10 feet tall above the ground, and they climb to the top and make camp for the evening. Night passes, and Phineas sleeps fitfully again, but his dreams are less intense this time, and the only image he remembers from them is one of a half-crazed halfling with small white flowers and a scent of mouse piss clinging to his tattered clothes, grinning out of the swirling shadows as he whispers, "Don't wander into the tall switchgrass." He wakes on the morning of the 10th day, feeling achy and congested, and the twins eat breakfast and break down their camp before setting out eastward. As they enter a new hex around midday, they find themselves once more ascending the Spiresian hills, and Phineas suffers another point of damage from the lingering effects of the toad's poison, leaving him with 5 hit points. Now, the outcome of their interaction with Thaddeus while exploring the previous day is that I skipped the next encounter roll. So because they headed in the direction that he had told them was safe as far as he was aware, they experience an uneventful day of travel. Phineas's cough diminishes a bit in the coolness and clear skies, and they manage to move at a quick pace that allows them to cover 30 miles instead of the usual 24. I am curious, however, to know what they would have encountered here had they not crossed paths with a half-crazed halfling yesterday, so I'm still going to let the dice tell me what's going on in this area today, and this will be an interesting bit of dramatic irony, given that this is information that we, as player and viewers, will know about the world that the characters who inhabit it will not be aware of. So I'm going to roll to see what they don't encounter here. And that's another 5. Which would have been another friend if they hadn't followed Thaddeus's directions, which is really interesting because it means that their interaction with one ostensibly helpful character cost them the potential assistance of another. And on the D10, that's a 3, which means that a cloaked woman has made this space her strange and dismal home. For 100 gold, she would have pointed out on the twins' map where a crown could be found. I would roll a dungeon entrance and place it 6 hexes from their current location, and the first loot roll in that location would result in the automatic discovery of a crown, which is not only dramatically ironic, but cosmically ironic, because a crown is exactly the thing they need to defeat the Lich King. Now, it wouldn't really matter anyway, because they don't have 100 gold between them at the moment, but in Dungeons & Dragons, traveling at a fast pace causes a -5 penalty to passive wisdom scores. So it seems that as they're making such good time through the hills of this part of the peninsula, they completely miss a faint trail that leads up to a decrepit-looking cabin, where a woman wearing a surprisingly ornate cloak sits in a rocking chair on the front porch, with her ferruginous hawk companion, watching and listening to all the noise that these 2 boys are making as they pass by her property. So the twins travel onward, not meeting the woman and her fierce-feathered friend until they reach an area with a stony overhang that provides a sheltered place to make camp for the evening. Night passes, and Phineas sleeps fitfully once again, his dreams still mostly jagged and senseless, and the only image he remembers from them is one of an impossibly old woman, wearing a surprisingly ornate cloak and sitting in a rocking chair, grinning out of the swirling shadows as she tells him, "The crownless king is waiting, but not for you." He wakes on the morning of the 11th day, feeling mildly exhausted, and Horace finally admits that at this point, he doesn't even believe that any Lich King has ever existed, or that the fiendish, disfigured face of Phineas's dreams was anything more than a poisonous hallucination. The 2 set out northeastward, and as they enter a new hex around midday, they continue making their way across the Spiresian hills, while Phineas suffers another point of damage from the lingering effects of the toad's poison, leaving him now with just 4 hit points. Because this is their first time entering this area, I'm going to roll the d12 to determine what they encounter here, and that's another 9, which is really interesting. So the twins travel through the afternoon until they reach a small meadow that dips down into a shallow basin at the center, and Horace immediately recognizes the distinctive scent of mouse piss. And in the middle of this basin, they find a ring of plants about 6 feet tall and covered with small white flowers in umbrella shaped clusters that match exactly the ones that were clinging to the tattered clothes of the half crazed halfling they encountered 2 days ago. And they remember the place near the waterfall that Tamarind had identified as a fairy circle back on the first day of this little misadventure. And they remember that fixtures like this are designed to fully heal anyone who rests in the area. So they set up camp in the meadow, a little ways back from the ring of plants, and they settle in for the evening and eat without conversation. The silence, again, broken only by the snapping of the fire and the occasional sound of Phineas coughing and clearing his throat. Night passes, and Phineas sleeps soundly for the first time in, what's it been, 4 days? His dreams start out hectic and fragmentary, but as the hours unfold, he begins to feel a sort of psychic breeze in his mind that gradually increases until it blows away all of the swirling shadows. The darkness resolves into the night sky, and Phineas finds himself sitting near a ring of bristlethorn bushes with Tamarind, while Horace and Erenor sleep nearby. And the Fey fellow smiles a little sadly as he says, "It seems that hope is lost." Phineas wakes on the morning of the 12th day, feeling more refreshed than he has in months, all of his hit points having been restored overnight to bring him all the way back up to 16, which is actually fairly impressive for a rogue, because that's as many hit points as a first-level barbarian with a constitution score of 18. His cough has cleared up entirely, and the creeping fatigue that had been spreading through his body has receded. They set out northwestward, making fantastic time through the morning and entering a new hex around midday to find themselves among the cypress and sequoia trees of the Harapan woods. A sense of stillness and serenity saturates the forest, and the twins travel without incident for a full 8 hours, encountering no foes or friends or fairy circles. At one point in the late afternoon, they do spot a massive ferruginous hawk, circling high overhead for about 20 minutes before it flies off toward the south, and they eventually reach a small glade where they set up camp for the evening and discuss what they plan on doing when they get back home. Horace admits that he's heading directly to the Cautionary tale to enjoy copious libations and some amorous companionship. And Phineas explains that he's going to deliver the carcass of the poisonous toad to the family apothecary, after which he also intends to visit the tavern and indulge in a taste of brandy. Horace is fully aware, of course, that Brandy is the curvaceous server that works the overnight shift, who his brother has been pining after for the better part of a year. Night passes, and Horace sleeps. Horace? My God. Horace. His name is Horace. Night passes, and Horace sleeps soundly for the first time in almost a week. He lays awake for the first hour, listening to the snapping of the fire as a few wolves call out to each other in the distance, and then he realizes that his brother's breathing is no longer jagged and raspy. He drifts off himself soon after that, sinking slowly through the gentle darkness until a faint voice reaches him from out beyond the cypress and sequoia trees. An iridescent veil of mist lies across the clearing, and he smells the sweet scent of tanglewood smoke as he notices that the campfire has already burned down to guttering embers. The faint voice continues calling out from the east, not urgent, but steady, and Horace wanders to the edge of the small glade as he follows the sound, discovering what looks like an overgrown game trail. He pauses next to a gnarled juniper, peering through the iridescent veil of mist before noticing a curious symbol carved into the trunk of the tree, what looks like a primitive image of a key with the wings of a hawk. At which point, he wakes on the morning of the 13th day, feeling a cool drizzle against his face. He wanders to the edge of the small glade to relieve himself on a gnarled juniper that looks oddly familiar, discovering what looks like an overgrown game trail and noticing a curious symbol carved into the trunk of the tree. The twins break down camp, and Phineas agrees to set out eastward along the nearly hidden pathway, mostly because Horace had accompanied Phineas south after his fiendish fever dreams. As they enter a new hex around midday, The drizzle subsides as they find themselves gradually descending into another low-lying wetland. And because this is their first time entering this area, I'm going to roll a d12 to determine what they encounter here. And that's a 6. So as they make their way across the Barasati Marsh, a faint voice reaches them from beyond the mangroves and the willows. Not urgent, but steady. Following the sound and announcing their own presence, they find a Svartalfar woman trying to read a hand-drawn map. She introduces herself as Hope Faulkner, before explaining that she was traveling from the city of Kobasun further to the north. And on a 3, she offers to pay the twins a gold piece to escort her not just to the next hex, but all the way to her destination, the town of Zergon Tal, where she plans to meet with a Corvidian healer known only as Ray. Given that the twins are currently carrying a total of 32 gold, they will be unable to afford any level advancement, but they do agree to deliver Hope back to town, and the 3 of them begin the hike back westward before making their camp for the evening. Night passes, and Hope sleeps more soundly than she has in about a week now that she has traveling companions again. She dreams of the silent stone staircase, as she has occasionally since that day in Beneth Nor. A bracing breeze drifts up out of that familiar darkness as she descends those 70 steps to a sprawling cavern, and as the swirling shadows shift around her, she becomes aware of the faint whisper of a presence in the same moment that she feels it become aware of her. She listens to her own breathing as she spots a shadow within a shadow, what looks like the silhouette of an emaciated figure slumped in an intricate throne, not simply positioned against the wall, but carved out of the stone itself. And on the figure's skull, she recognizes a luminous palladium crown with 3 obsidian stones across the brow, reflecting a light with no source. She struggles to cross the cavern toward the figure, but gets no closer no matter how fast she runs, and a rumbling laugh rolls through the deepening darkness. At which point she wakes on the morning of the 14th day, as a bracing breeze drifts out across the mangroves and the willows, and the party sets out westward, returning to the cypress and sequoia trees of the Harapon Woods. I'm still going to roll to determine what they encounter here this time, but having already visited this area 2 days ago, I'm going to roll a d6 instead of a d12. And on a 2, they hear the sounds of a creature somewhere out ahead in the forest, which means that I get to roll a d12 on the creature table instead. That is a 6. So by early afternoon, the group reaches the edge of a small field, and they remain hidden along the tree line as they spot a 9-foot-tall colossus of a woman with platinum hair single-handedly dismantling a downed silver spruce with a great axe. As she builds a campfire out of the remnants of the tree, Phineas jokes that the 3 of them can absolutely defeat a solitary giant. And Horace reminds him that he was nearly poisoned to death by a toad the size of his fist. And the group decides against engaging in a confrontation. So I'm going to roll another evasion attempt and hope that it goes better than the first. And that's a 3. So, acknowledging the folly of picking a fight with this colossus of a woman, the party waits until she gets her fire started, and then they successfully navigate their way around the small field, continuing on for several more hours before making their own camp. As the skies darken, the 3 of them listen to the snapping of the fire and a few wolves calling out to each other in the distance, and they trade stories about their favorite scars. Horace reveals the 4 jagged claw marks across his left calf that he received when he tried to catch a warg cub with the intention of adopting it as a pet 10 years ago. Phineas reveals the matching knots of crooked flesh in the palm and back of his right hand that he received 5 years ago when he got so drunk that he became convinced he could catch an arrow shot from a longbow, and wound up getting shot through the hand in the process of trying to prove it. And Hope reveals the spiderweb of thin, discolored lines covering her left arm above the wrist to just below the shoulder that she received when she was struck by the lightning breath weapon of a blue dragon that attacked the city of Beneth Nor nearly 15 years ago. Night passes, and Phineas sleeps so deeply that even Hope's snoring doesn't interrupt his rest. and he dreams of the rolling summits of the Spiresian Hill, where he finds himself among the firs and pines and evergreens. He listens to the sound of a few wolves calling out to each other in the distance, and then he hears his own voice and Horace's somewhere down the hill as they pass by the property. And he turns away from them, heading up the faint trail that leads to the front porch of a decrepit-looking cabin, where he spots a woman wearing a surprisingly ornate cloak, as she sits in a rocking chair. He approaches without speaking, and she tells him that he's been gone for a very long time. And she laughs gently when he asks who she is, telling him only, "Follow the best melody through the pitchstone gateway." And as she looks at him, the tilt of her head, and the arch of her eyebrow, and the quirk at the corner of her mouth make him realize who she is. This is his sister, but so much older, and he can only ask, "Damaris?" At which point, he wakes on the morning of the 15th day, and the group sets out westward, exiting the Harapon woods. They enter a familiar hex around midday, and within a couple hours, they find their way back to the Marsantha Road, following to arrive at the western gate of their hometown of Zurgon Tal. Now, I ordinarily wouldn't roll for an encounter here because this is the starting hex and essentially constitutes a clearing in which a settlement has been built. But in the interest of getting the full 12 years experience, I'm going to incorporate material from the village expansion rules as well. And that provides ways to discover new settlements and a variety of activities to engage in when the party visits them. Now, there is no universal definition of a village, but in the state of Louisiana, a settlement is considered a village if it has fewer than 1,000 residents. So I'm going to say that Zurgon Tal currently has a population of 891, down just slightly from the 893 it had about a week ago. When visiting any village, I get to choose my party's actions for the day, though I could hypothetically roll for it since the rulebook lists 6 options. My characters could form a new party and leave immediately. They could visit the village healer and get healed at a cost of 1 gold per hit point. They could buy and sell any ordinary goods. They could gamble and hope the chance is on their side. They could investigate for rumors at a cost of 5 golds for bribes. Or they could carouse by enjoying copious libations and potentially some amorous companionship. These activities will consume the majority of their time and will be the most noteworthy events during the day. And if they do anything other than form a new party, they must also carouse in the evening, even if they did so during the day. They then have to spend the night at a cost of 1 gold per party member, leaving no sooner than the next morning, unless otherwise specified through some unfortunate turn of events. And they can spend as many days as they wish in a village, so long as they aren't run out of town or imprisoned. So, what remains of our team passes through the western gate of Zurgon Tal, and Horace immediately splits off toward the Cautionary Tale to commence his carousal, while Phineas escorts Hope to the secluded cottage of the Corvidian healer known only as Ray, before visiting his family apothecary to deliver his notes and sketches of some of the topography of the 2,600 square miles south and east of the town, as well as the carcass of the toad that recently reduced the town's population from 893 to 891. Then he heads over to the tavern to find his brother several drinks deep already, so he orders a couple of rounds for himself to start catching up. So now I get to roll a d12 to determine the outcome of this bit of afternoon revelry. And that is a 9. And a 9 is probably one of the major reasons that they didn't want their younger sister following them around. Because on a 9, a villainous villager attacks. So I have to roll a d8 to discover what sort of altercation the twins find themselves drawn into. And that's going to be a 1, which is an angry mob. So I get to roll another 4d4 to determine how many furious townfolk they have to contend with. Because even in the relative safety of their own hometown, what remains of this team cannot catch a break. So that's 3 plus 4 plus 2 plus 3 for 12 angry men, to quote screenwriter Reginald Rose, although at least half of them are women, non-binary, or agender. So what ends up happening is that Horace and Phineas become steadily more inebriated until they hear someone in the tavern scream out, "Murderers!" And the entire place goes silent. And across the room, they see Thaddeus Bradford standing on top of the bar and pointing at them. He was already half crazed, and now the half that wasn't crazed is fully drunk instead. And he's insisting that not only did the twins kill the healer and the Fae fellow out in the Xantray Forest, but that he saw them do it, and that they're not even denying it because they know it's true. And he somehow sounds so convinced that he actually did see it happen that a dozen of the patrons start rushing toward the twins, who both sprint for the door because these are people they know, despite the fact that, for whatever reason, they seem to believe the persuasive accusations of this stranger, and they don't want to hurt any of these people. So they are absolutely going to attempt an evasion roll here, and that's a 4. So apparently they do catch a bit of a break here. Although I don't know what loot there is for them to retrieve in this scenario, except maybe their lives. So the first of the patrons heading toward them stumbles against the table and sends a couple of chairs scattering, and a few of the other patrons get tripped up and caught in each other's ways, by which point Phineas and Horace have made it out the front door and into the street, where they instinctively split up and disappear into the pedestrian traffic. They dart in opposite directions without a word because they're rogues. They have all sorts of escape routes planned and memorized, and so they both know to head toward the northern end of town, where they reunite at an old abandoned temple to some forgotten minor deity. And they make their way into the undercroft of the building, where they find the room that used to be the pantry, and behind a half rotted bookshelf, they find the entrance to the tunnels that the Wild Hearts had used hundreds of years ago when the city was invaded by demons. Traversing the passageway for the next few hours, they emerge into a ravine about half a mile northwest of the base of the Spiresian Hills as darkness has almost fully fallen. I'm going to say that they're still just inside the border of the starting hex, mostly so that I don't have to roll them another encounter yet. And they're going to find a cluster of jackalberry trees where they're going to make camp without a fire because they don't want to give away their location. And they're going to spend the next couple of hours figuring out what to do because by the book, the village of Zergon Tal can no longer be used by what remains of this party, which means that they have effectively been exiled from their own hometown. And that, I think, is an appropriately sobering note to end this session on. And I've already got a pretty good idea what I'm going to call this installment. Thank you all for bearing witness to this unconventional adventure, and as always, any comments, questions, or criticisms can go downstairs in the Undercroft. Behave yourselves down there, because I will be watching. If you enjoyed this bit of solitary storytelling, feel free to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tap the notification bell to ensure that you will be among the first to know when new chapters of this unfolding story debut here on Table for One.